Thank you all for being here this morning. Welcome to our assessment workshop on using the results of assessment lessons from the Wabash study. I appreciate you being here, and I hope you'll find it very useful. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jillian Pierce. I am Director of Learning Assessment in the Office of the Provost. And I have worked with many of you already. For those of you I have not yet worked with, I look forward to doing so. We have some information about our assessment process on the table and some deadlines. And it's certainly my hope that this workshop will be useful to you as you engage in this work. I want to introduce Charles Blaich and Kathy Wise of the Wabash Center of Inquiry. Charles Blaich has been director of the Wabash Center of Inquiry since 2003. As director of the Wabash Center and as associate director, Kathy Wise is associate director of the Wabash Center of Inquiry. They have worked on a national study, the Wabash National Study of Liberal Arts Education, which was a longitudinal study involving 49 colleges and universities, and this study was designed in collaboration with researchers at the University of Iowa, the University of Michigan, Miami University, and ACT. Since that time, they have been working to disseminate some of the findings of this study, and they've worked with over 200 institutions to help share those results and help people make assessment a more useful process. So that's our interest today. Some of their publications include From Gathering to Using Assessment Results, Lessons from the Wabash National Study, and Knowing About versus Knowing How. So please join me in welcoming Charles Blaich and Kathy Wise.
Thank you for coming out. I know you're very, very busy, and so I really appreciate you taking some time here. And it's good work, and hopefully we will help you get some ideas about how you might make assessment more profitable in your efforts to help your students learn a little better. A few notes quickly before we get into the meeting. Please feel free to ask questions during the process of this. We invite them. Stop us. We are recording this, so when you do, just wait for someone in the room to get a microphone to you so that your questions that will stump me will be recorded, and watch my awkward pauses as I try to answer them. We are sending a PDF out of the presentation, so if you want these notes, don't worry about, you can take notes and all, but we will send a copy out of the presentation. We have handouts on the table. They're not going to be used until later on today. They include some information about a simulation of a real-life situation, includes some pieces of assessment reports that we've seen in the past. If you have questions, no, there is no Starfleet Academy place. Well,
there might be.
There might be. We don't know this, but that's not the real assessment report. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about how the people we've worked with over the course of the last 10 years, our experience in trying, when we did the Wabash study, and we did do a study that resulted in 60 or 70 publications, whatever, in higher education research literature. Our goal from the start with that study was to create something that would be useful to the institutions that participated, a model where we would get high quality data to faculty and staff, and they could use that data to improve their efforts to help students learn. And over the course of time, we've learned a lot of things about how both we approached that process incorrectly from the start, and I think some of the challenges with the way assessment is often framed and talked about on campuses. So first, in that time, we've encountered and worked with a lot of people and programs who actually do wonderful work with assessment, really formative and useful work. And so we've tried over the course of time to sort of gather the lessons from those people. And we're going to talk about those this morning. And we're going to talk a lot about this in terms of reframing assessment, because assessment's got this really weird history, right? If you go back 30 years or longer, we were all doing some kinds of assessment if we were looking at how our students were doing in our programs and our classes, and talking to one another about how we might change things. The process got formalized in the 90s and early 2000s in terms of the accreditation, the accountability movement, right? And so accreditors have come along, specialized accreditors, the regional accreditors. And the real challenge, the thing about that is that once you're working with an accreditor and thinking of assessment from that standpoint, you're changing the nature of it, right? You're changing the nature of it to proving your case to sometimes skeptical outsiders that you're actually doing a good job. Okay? And that's a particular stance toward data, requires a particular kind of reporting, et cetera, at its best. I know it can go at its worst too. But you can also understand or think about assessment as something trying to improve things, not prove to outsiders, but actually as a systematic process to improve the quality of your own work. Okay? The thing about it is when you, and this is an old saw on assessment, the way you think about assessment when you're trying to use it to improve the quality of your work, improve your students' education, you really approach it from a very different stance and do different things than you do when you try and use it to prove to the outside world. Okay? So we're going to talk about what we've learned about people who've used this effectively for improving it. Right? And I would say in all these cases, the people who have used this for improvement processes, focused on it for making their students better and not worrying about the outside piece, they've all successfully then converted those, or the reports and narratives of that work, to their work with outside accreditors. So it's not like you leave the accreditation thing behind, but rather than thinking about it in terms of accreditation, they think about it in terms of how do I make things better for my students. So we'll talk about that a little bit.
First, I'm going to step back a moment and tell you a little bit more about who we are and why we're here talking to you this morning. Jillian gave us a wonderful introduction, but I know I still have people who friends I've known for many years who are like, so what do you do again? So I'll try to explain that. So Charlie and I run this thing called the Center of Inquiry. We did not name it, but in case you were wondering, the Center of Inquiry is located in Crawfordsville, Indiana. Little known secret there. But our purpose in doing the work that we do is to strengthen liberal arts education for all students. So just a small little thing. And when we talk about liberal arts education, we mean any form of education that promotes broad qualities of head and heart, things like critical thinking, moral reasoning, leadership, political and social involvement, all of the things that you will see if you pick up the mission statement from pretty much any college or university in the U.S. And as Jillian and Charlie mentioned, we have done national longitudinal research. We have worked with program reviews, grant evaluations. We have tons of publications. We'll give you a link to our website later if you want to read them. You can. But in all of the work, our focus has been working with faculty, with staff, with students, administrators at colleges and universities around the country to try to help them figure out how to gather evidence about what's going on in their classrooms and their programs and use that evidence to improve their institutions for their students. So I should say we are not affiliated with any sort of government agency, not federal, not state. We're not working at the policy level. We're not trying to shift levers that will change things in one broad swoop. We're really much more at the grassroots level, working on the ground with the people who are working with students every day. We are also not affiliated with any accrediting agency. Sometimes people think we are, but we are not. We are a non-profit organization, not-for-profit, and we do this work because we think it's really important, and we want to help institutions get better and help our students get more from their college education. Charlie talked about framing assessment, and in our travels around the country, because we work with, as Jillian said, probably over 200 institutions, and this is institutions of all size, mission, shape, flavor. I mean, anything from small 300-student private liberal arts college in Vermont to large research universities. So we have seen many institutions and heard many ways of framing assessment, both good and bad. And I can say it's really important the way you frame assessment. So framing it as the accreditors are coming, we need to do it to ourselves before they do it to us is not a good way to frame assessment. It doesn't motivate people. It doesn't get anyone on board.
That was a headline of an Inside Higher Education article, by the way.
It is just terrible, terrible.
Yeah.
So that's not the way we think about assessment. For us, assessment really is an evidence-driven means of improving teaching for faculty and staff. So it's all about what happens with our students. And we try to, everything we do is to get the assessment work to the classroom, to our programs, to our work with students. And for us, this is sort of an overarching principle when we think about it, and we use these terms interchangeably. So for us, good assessment is good faculty and staff development, which is good teaching. And I'll tell you how we mean that. So good assessment is gathering evidence to figure out how much and what our students are learning in our classes, in our programs. But we don't do that just to create some snazzy report that gets sent off to a black hole somewhere or put in a binder on a shelf or now it's stored electronically. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to gather this evidence so we can use it to make things better, to make improvements. So for us, assessment really is faculty and staff development. The two have to be connected. And that gets to teaching, because assessment is about teaching, but we are teaching the teachers. So we are teaching faculty and staff, people who work with students every day, how to be better at their teaching, and then that makes students experience better teaching. That's a nice little circle here. So we will use assessment, faculty, staff development, teaching kind of interchangeably because for us they are all linked. So now as Charlie said, we are going to talk, we have been many, many places. We are on the road, 30 some weeks a year. We've talked to a lot of people at a lot of different places and learned things about doing assessment well and doing it not so well. So we're going to share some of the things that we've learned with you, and we're going to talk about how good assessment, or assessment done well, has 7 characteristics. And again, this is based on our experience of things that we've seen have been helpful. So I'll read off the list and then we'll go through each one in turn. So an assessment is done well. It is useful. Shocking, I know. It is focused on 3 basic questions. It is grounded in conversations among colleagues. It leads to experiments. It's focused and persistent. It's sustainable, and it helps faculty and staff hone their craft. And now, we will go into each of those.
Okay, so assessment done well is useful. So this would be, when we go to campuses sometimes, we actually are invited to, and this will sound like the 4th circle of hell, to assess the assessment process, right? And we actually think that's a good idea in some ways. And so these are sort of the characteristics. When we ask questions about places, and we look at places, and we talk to people who are doing things, and these are characteristics of assessment that's going well, okay? So first, assessment that's going well should actually energize people. It's actually kind of exciting when it's going well, believe it or not. It's not about piling through reports, but it's exciting because you're getting some information that is kind of cool and useful and interesting that you can apply in your courses and programs. And I think, we said this yesterday, but one of the little things we do when we talk to people about assessment in their institution is if you ask someone in a department who's just had a meeting about assessment, and you say, did you get anything you could use in your classes out of that meeting? And if they say, yeah, I got a couple ideas, I'm going to try some things next year, that's a sign it's going well, right? If it's no, we sat and did this thing, we signed up for this report, we struggle with our learning outcomes or something like that, then that's not energizing, it's not useful. What is the utility? What's the payoff for the work? And we should design the assessment work so that the payoff's pretty damn quick, right? It comes back to you quickly. Secondly, assessment is actually, it's kind of interesting, for people who do it well, it's an intellectually engaging and challenging inquiry about how a wide range of students in your classes, the range of them, learn in a real world situation. It's actually very difficult kind of research. These are not controlled studies. You're not doing random assignment. You have all sorts of things going on multiply in classrooms. So it's actually very difficult to try and figure out what the heck is going on. But for the departments that engage in it well, the people who engage in it well, they actually find the inquiry kind of interesting, just like they find their own research interesting. It's a puzzle, it's a question. What is it? Why aren't students getting this particular concept? Or why are some students doing really well in this and others not? What's going on here? And for some departments and some people we've worked with, they will go on each year and I would call them tweaking. They tweak. They think, oh, well, this year we'll change a little bit of the readings, we'll do this, that, and the other thing. And that's very satisfying because they see this slow, gradual change in how courses are structured or the content of the courses in the department. Other folks we've seen who have dive in for years on a particular question. We were just at a conference where some folks were doing some work in composition, or down at Drexel, who over the course of 3 or 4 years, the folks responsible for composition have been struggling with the different texts to use and other things, but they kind of enjoy, they try things each year. Sometimes it gets better, sometimes it doesn't, and they're in that process of the sort of asking the question and sort of digging at it. Third, this is really weird. So employees engaging pedagogists in high-impact practices to work with colleagues and evidence. So what do we mean by this? And we'll expand this a little bit later, but the typical way assessment works in most places we've been at least is that there's a report. Someone, it could be institutional research, or it could be the designated department assessment person, will do some sort of summary report and the report's passed around. And then people might read it, they might not read it, and so on. Don't know. The places where they do the best work with assessment, people will actually work on assessment in a way that's using sort of like good teaching practices, right? So will department meetings be structured where people are actually asking questions, engaging in conversations, and trying to figure something out about a problem, looking at different pieces of evidence, trying to figure out what's going on, like discovery learning? Are people getting in faculty clusters and they're really interested, there's this real problem that's going on in the composition, we heard about clusters yesterday in the composition here. You know, would thematic composition courses be better? Let's 6 of us try that. And they're doing some reading on those thematic, on how to do thematic stuff in composition. And they're talking about it and trying it. That's when people start to I think, do better with it. They're not thinking of it as a report they're grinding out. They're actually engaging it in sort of the same way you would try and engage active learning for your students in your classrooms. And the last thing about assessment done well, and this is, again, when we work with departments, it's like, well, if this is not happening, you need to change things, which is you should actually be learning something. And if at the end of 3 or 4 years, nothing is palpably changed for your students, or even 2 or 3 years, nothing's palpably changed for your students, or no experiments have come out, you need to revise the process. It's not yielding enough. Okay? You're doing it for other reasons. You're not doing it in a way that's efficacious towards the ends of having some impact on your students, and that just makes it drudgery.
So we've also seen that assessment, when it's done well and it's effective and useful for people, tends to focus on 3 basic questions. Those questions are, where do my students start? What happens in my class? And where do they, my students, finish? And I think that we tend to focus on the 2 on the end, especially the last one, where do they wind up, and where do they start, so we can see how much they've changed and grown over the course of our classes, our majors. But assessment is about us. It's not really about our students. And by that I mean it's about the work that we do in the classroom and developing our work in our classes and our programs so that it's more beneficial for our students. And in order to figure that out, we really need to know information about that second question, the what happens in my class. Because say, for example, you're teaching a class and you're looking at students writing, and at the end of the class you're like, wow, they can't write at all. This is terrible. I mean, I know that never happens. And you're like, well, what do I do? Just teach harder next time?
Teach harder.
which is sometimes what students do when they don't do what I do. I just study harder because they don't know what happened, what went wrong. And that's where getting information about what happens in the class, so things like, how much do my students study? Do I lecture too much? Do I have the right readings? Are my assignments effective? Are my students writing enough? Do I require too much memorization? Is my class organized coherently? These are the kinds of questions that we need to get information on, we need to ask. And the important thing here is these questions in the middle need to be from our students' perspective, not from ours. So I might think that my class is completely clear, organized, coherent, and that I am assigning the exact right readings and they're really effective for my students. But if my students don't understand what I'm saying and they think things are unorganized and unclear, they're not going to get anything from my class. So it matters what they think, not what I think, and not what my colleague thinks. Charlie can come into my class and say, you're doing a great job. If my students are sitting there with blank looks on their faces, it's not good. Because I'm not teaching Charlie, I'm trying to teach my students. So it's really important to get information about these 3 questions. And I think we tend to focus on the first, the where they start and where they end, and not as much what's going on, what students experience in our courses and our programs.
So let me just hit this point again. And this is, so in my time, back before I started working on this, I was a bird researcher and worked with dolphins and communication and auditory communication. And so that the transition from that to working with surveys is, yeah. I had my bird thought surveys, I couldn't figure them out, so sorry. So one of the things Kathy has said here, I really want, and back in that time, I remember first encountering this notion of in education of constructivism, that the student creates a world, and that the idea that their impressions of things are more important than what I might think in my classroom. And I was incredibly skeptical about the idea because, after all, I'm the expert. I've been teaching for 20 some odd years. I know what's going on, and if the students aren't picking it up, maybe they're just not working hard enough. The Wabash study really changed my mind on this a little bit. Again, it's not that students don't bear a lot of responsibility and don't need to work hard. But in the Wabash study, what we did is we had longitudinal measures like standardized tests of critical thinking, moral reasoning, We had tests on dispositions that we gave them repeatedly over the course of their time in college. And we also asked them questions like Kathy just described of, so, you know, are the goals of your classes clear? All sorts of impressions about their classroom environment, right? Well, it turned out their impressions of the classroom environment are what predicted their change on these other standardized measures. Okay, so whether or not their impressions are misguided in our eyes, how they're understanding the classes, how they're understanding your teaching and my teaching, actually is an important role in how much they learn. And in fact, in some ways, as we've done more of this, and in fact, I would say just the opposite. If you look at faculty impressions of how clear their instruction is or how clear classes are, they're almost uncorrelated with learning. Okay? And it's almost like we talk about study abroad and so on, the idea of learning to understand the world from a different perspective. But the reality of someone who's an expert in a disciplinary area, remembering what it's like to be 18 years old from a cognitive standpoint, and how they're hearing the material and framing it, their prior assumptions are, that's actually a really big jump. And one of the things, oftentimes experts are not great teachers because so many of the things that the assumptions they have about the world are now implicit, they're unconscious, and they're not bringing them to the fore when they're thinking about teaching their students. So this is the other thing. Assessment is ground in conversations. This is a really big piece. The people who do assessment well, that it's useful, are people who end up talking to each other a lot about what they're seeing in their classes, what they're finding in these reports, and so on. And it's really useful. It overcomes something that people call course-ocentrism. I love that, course-ocentrism. And creates an atmosphere in which we feel safe now, openly sharing what goes on in our classrooms, our struggles, what's going well with our colleagues. Right? So course-ocentrism, I wish I made that up, but I didn't. Gerald Graff, who is the past president of the Modern Language Association, has coined this term. He says, I believe that our experience of teaching in hermetically sealed classrooms makes us, to coin a word, course-ocentric. Course-ocentrism, like its ethno, ego, and euro counterparts, is a kind of tunnel vision in which a little part of the world becomes the whole, or our little part of the world becomes the whole. We get so used to the restricted confines of our own courses that we become oblivious to the fact, or simply uninterested in it, that students are enrolled in other courses whose teachers at any moment may be undercutting our most cherished beliefs. Okay? And there's a little truth in this. I mean, I have to say, I taught in a psychology department for years. There were 4 of us. We each taught 4 introductory sections. We each had our own texts. We each had our own ideas what was important. We didn't really talk to each other about them. We had our own syllabi, and we loved teaching our own stuff. Now, if I thought about it for just a second, those students were going downstream into other courses in psychology and relying on that first course as somehow preparation for that. Yet, we were doing 4 completely different things. We didn't talk about it. How's that helpful? Okay. Other things. Assessment is not the work of a solitary colleague who is assigned, or volunteers, prior to tenure for the task of writing the assessment report. This is great. You go to a department and say, so, your last assessment report, what did you learn in your last assessment report? And sometimes in good departments, people say, well, you know, we've really been struggling with this concept of, we name a concept, and we've tried this other thing. We're going to change something we're doing in our second course. Great. The worst ones are, you go, how's it going? What'd you learn? And they say, well, Bob, who's coming for tenure this year, Bob did our assessment report, and you really should ask him. And you go to Bob's chair and say, how did the assessment report go? I don't know, I just passed it up to the dean. It's not, if it's solitary work like that, you're just pushing paper around. And it's not even good use of Bob's time. Secondly, uses conversations instead of extensive quantitative or qualitative analyses to make sense of evidence. This is a really important point. Now, I am a gearhead. I like analyzing data. When I had the Wabash study data, it was phenomenal. When I did my bird research, I would, little small sample research, 30 birds. It was cool. And suddenly I had 17,000 people with 800 variables. Oh boy, it was great, okay? But the reality is most of the best assessment work we see is much more conversational than it is analytic. And so I'll give you an example of this. Again, we've seen places where people will do, like the National Survey of Student Engagement will come in, and institutional research will sit down and hammer out a very extensive report. It can be 30 or 40 pages long, lots of graphs and things like that, and no one will ever read it. About 8 years ago, we were at University of Rhode Island, where Deborah Grossman Garber, who's now in the State Commission, was the assessment director on campus. She said, well, watch what we'll do. We're going to work on NESI. I said, okay, let's watch this. And she brought in a room just like this with tables like this. And she had, I think she snipped it up. She created snippets of NESI information. You know, a page, 5 or 6 or 10 questions. Plopped a different page down at each table across the room. So just simple means, frequencies, you know, how many said very well, whatever it is on the thing. And then had each table just start talking about what they were seeing, what was important, what wasn't important. And then she had a report out. And then she had people talk about what they saw in the other data, switch data around, and a report out. And what was fascinating, after about 3 hours, what you saw, of course, of about 100 people, faculty and staff, who had come to some consensus that here's the 3 or 4 points of this data that are worth pursuing. The conversations drove that. And it was really interesting because my typical experience is when you give out a report is that we all become very academic, right? What's the academic response to a report? Let's critique the methodology, right? That's what you do. We're good at this. This is our job. What's your sample size? Did you, you know, and so, but once people started looking at it and making sense of it, in a sense, they were owning some of the conclusions that were coming out, and it made a lot more movement than the hours and hours spent on doing the analyses, and it created some awareness among the people around the room what was going on in the data. Okay. So again, assessment should lead to actions, not reports. If you've been doing assessment, doing reports, and but you can't really think of 3 or 4 things you've changed in the last year to experiment, got to do something different. And the last thing, and this is one place, one of the tensions with assessment is assessment like research or not. And I'd say it's not like research. I have to say that we cannot do, I said before that we're not looking at student learning in a highly controlled situation. That if we were doing, for example, qualitative research on student interviews, the time it would take us to code and review and transcribe it would be so long that the students would long be gone. We're on a much shorter horizon than this. And I think what we're trying to do, every year we make changes and decisions in our departments and our courses, and assessment should be inform that process, make that process a little better, a little more useful, but not reach the standard of research. But where I think it's like research, at least when I was in PhD camp, the idea was research didn't really happen until you presented it, until you published it, until it was out in the world, until someone else saw it. And I think with assessment, this is also true. That for it to be useful, you have to not just have a finding from your class or your program, but some other people have to hear about it. Not so they can critique it, but so they can learn from it. So they can learn something you tried that was interesting, or learn something you did with your students that may be beneficial to their students. So everyone in the small departments at universities, which are highly solid, right, actually learns from each other, can move forward a little faster without reinventing the wheel as they're doing their assessment processes. So is this a student at Boston University here? Is that what that is? Does anyone know what this is, by the way? Obviously a person sleeping, but does anyone know what it represents? Yeah. So this is from a 2011 article in the New York Times about medical interns and sleep deprivation. And if you remember about 2009, 10, and 11, there was this whole ongoing controversy. How long were people in residency staying awake? How many hours should they stay awake? And some studies, people did some studies where people who had been staying awake for 36 hours, whatever, turns out they make some mistakes. Who knew, right? But there's sort of this macho thing about it because, damn it, I did it when I was in, whatever. And so there was finally a case, I think, it was a New York Daily News, a person who was a columnist, his daughter died when an intern made a bad decision about, she came in with a fever, and she died because of that decision. So there's some movement nationally to then say, well, look, we can't have people staying up for 36 hours. We have to put on limitations on the number of hours people can stay awake or on when they were working, and that swept across the country and people did it. Right? So people are monitoring this, saying, okay, now that we've done this, should the frequency of mistakes begin to decline now? Right? Should the frequency of mistakes people are making in emergency rooms and so on, should those mistakes decline? And people expected they would. Okay? And they didn't. They didn't at all. And they didn't because having more doctors on board may create something called the handoff problem. And here's the summary piece in the article. But fixating on work hours has meant overlooking other issues like lack of supervision or the failure to use more reliable computerized records, Worse still, the reforms may have created new, unexpected sources of mistakes. Shorter shifts mean doctors have less continuity with their patients. If one doctor leaves, another must take over. Work hour reductions lead to more handoffs of patients, and the number of these handoffs is one of the strongest risk factors for error. As a result, many hospital patients are at the mercy of a real-life game of telephone, where a message is passed from doctor to doctor and frequently garbled in the process. Handoff. Okay. So why is that important? Well, most of our departments and most of our general education programs are nothing more than handoffs, right? You take my Psych 1 class, now you go to Psych 20 with Kathy. You take this course in general education, now you go to that one over there. Taking these 3 courses is supposed to get you somewhere. You'll take one with me, you'll take one with you, and a year later you'll take one with you. What's the continuity across that? That in some ways in higher education, we actually have adopted a really interesting model of education where students can take courses all over the place from different people who may or may not be communicating, and we expect them to progress intellectually. Okay? Now, sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. My whole point about assessment and conversation is that if the people teaching those courses are talking to each other, talking about what they're learning, talking about what happens to students as they're coming through, the handoff problem gets a lot less. The chance that students' education will be progressive across these courses increases.
So just wondering about the conversation piece, you having conversations, and if you're going to provide any guidance on that, because I find that sometimes conversations can tend to go down the rabbit hole and lead to, student blaming, or,
Yes.
This is the way I've always done things and this is how I do things, kind of. So I was just wondering if you had any guidance around generating productive conversations that lead to really thoughtful action.
We're not going to talk about it. We didn't have it in the slides. It's too deep, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the conversations have to be structured in a way and led so that A, they don't do the student blaming thing is a classic piece. Rabbit hole is a classic piece, like in a meeting almost, right? If you have a well-structured meeting, you want it to be formative across time. So yeah, I agree. We're not going to go into that today. We sometimes want departments to just start talking before we then talk about the best practices in conversation. But the practices in conversation have to start from the assumption that we're here to help the students, regardless of, it may be the case that admissions has done a horrible job giving us terrible students, but there are students now. Okay, there are students, and what we have to talk about is stuff that can advance their learning and make our work a little bit more effective and keeping that point. It's a great point, thank you.
This is a big question, and maybe it should be left till last, or maybe it should be left off the table altogether and we should tiptoe away from it quietly.
So if you see me leaving, you'll know what the answer is.
Okay, but you've said that assessment is not like research in that it's not controlled. I think there's a more important reason, a way in which it's not like research, and that is it doesn't count. It doesn't count towards our reputations, towards our careers, towards our personal advancement in terms of tenure in a major research institution like this. Every hour that you spend doing assessment is an hour that you spend not working on that article that you need to get out in order to get your merit raise. So it seems to me that the notion that we are going to spend a lot of time on conversations and networking and being in committees and sharing and caring about each other's courses requires an inversion of institutional values that is not likely to happen. Would you like to talk about that, or would you like to not?
I can agree with you. Yeah, I agree completely. All I can do this morning is offer the sort of, for those of you who wish to do well by your students, this is a way to make it work. I think I can make the less morally satisfying case that you're going to be doing some of this anyway, so you might as well do it in a way that works. Well, I couldn't. Okay, thank you. It's a little instrumental, but you're good. No, you might as well make it work for you a little bit, I think. And I think that's why I think I tried to emphasize a little bit at the beginning that people who do take this approach are also, it's also counting for their external audiences, their external accreditation, so that there is you are doing some work swapping there. But the last thing I said, I couldn't agree with you more, actually, that I do think it's, I understand this is true not just at research universities. Surprisingly, at smaller liberal arts colleges, especially the more elite ones, people understand that the prestige nationally to the outside world is gained for more research. Okay, there's ongoing pressures to do more research there as well. And I understand it's a zero-sum game. And I would actually say to institutions that, like at my own institution, which is a very small one, that it would be wise to you got to cut something out so people can do this. It may be to de-elevate research a little bit. It may be to change committee work, college service in some ways, university service. But you have to, if you believe that student learning is an important priority of your institution, of the 18,000 students who are paying an average of what, $25,000 a year with discounts here, that is important, then you have to spend some time working together to get better at it. And that you have to give faculty and staff time to do that and reward for doing it well. So I agree on that point. I don't disagree whatsoever.
You were talking about the importance of the student evaluation, the students,
Perspective.
what's happening in that middle
Right.
section.
Yep.
And the way we get that information, seems to me, is through our student course evaluations.
You can.
We've been spending a lot of time looking at our course evaluations, trying to evaluate outcome from the student perspective, as well as a lot of other things. So I just wondered if you were going to be talking about that's the way we try to get that information from our students. I was wondering if you were going to talk at all about that and sort of how to best do that.
I can talk, we were not planning to, I can talk briefly about it now if that's helpful. So the student evaluations piece is challenging. You don't have a standard one here, is that right? Or is there a standard, okay. I haven't seen it. Most of the ones that we've seen across the country are really not effective tools for improving classroom practice. There's some things like the idea form that actually get at pedagogy stuff. Most of the ones that we've seen, it's like no judgment on what we've seen here, are really about liking the professor, and they tend to be, the answers tend to be very, you just check 4, 4, 4, 4, or 5, very homogeneous down the set of questions. I don't know if that's true here. Some of the institutions that we've worked with when we did the Wabash study have taken questions from the Wabash study that proved to be useful in predicting student growth about clarity in organization, or taking questions from the National Survey of Student Engagement, or the law school version of it, right? And converted those into questions about individual classes that faculty could use and administer. Those actually gave quite different results for faculty than the typical ones they've been using. They gave much more variance. Their questions were not all uniformly, 3 or 4s. They got some high and some low and useful. So your classroom evaluations can be useful if those instruments, as the psychometricians would call them, are actually designed to get at the conditions that support student learning in the classroom. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. The question about outcomes, whether students can self-assess outcomes, we've looked at that as well. And they're not terribly good, actually. Actually, humans are in general very good at saying how much have you learned or grown on this quality over the last 6 months. We actually had, on the Wabash study, we had standardized measures like critical thinking and so on. We also had questions, how much has your critical thinking changed? And measures of attitudes of diversity, and then questions about how much of your attitudes about diversity changed. And there's almost no correlation between the students' actual change over time and what students self-reported. The self-reports are important there because they do point to satisfaction and engagement in some way. And that is, so you don't want students to be saying, so it's like it's necessary and not sufficient. If they're saying, yeah, I'm learning a lot, that's a good sign that they're engaged in the classroom. They may not actually be learning a lot. But if they say, I'm not learning a damn thing, that's a cause for concern. That makes any sense. But yeah, you can use those evaluations. There are great surveys out there that people do, but they really are designed around research on student learning and asking questions about that, and less about some of the things we tend to see in course evaluations, again, without judging yours. Does that help? Okay. Yeah.
I run the writing program here, and we have a large body of non-tenure track faculty members teaching in it. One of their concerns is there's a kind of dissonance between the two goals of evaluations.
Yes,
right?
that's a really good point. Thank you.
Is the evaluation for formative inquiry,
Right.
or is the evaluation about performance judgment of the faculty member?
Yeah.
And
You're right.
I see my faculty be stuck in a position of saying, well, I tried something, I know I'm going to take a hit on my evaluations, but it's worth it to me because I want to try something. And that should not be a situation into which faculty are placed. So have you seen models where evaluations function in both of these capacities effectively, or is it really one or the other?
We couldn't agree.
That's a huge problem,
Yeah.
and we've heard that everywhere, because obviously
Yeah.
nobody wants something that's going to have an impact on their promotion and tenure to happen, nothing bad. So you really need, we encourage institutions to really separate anything that's used for promotion and tenure from the assessment process. Create sort of a firewall between the information on what you're doing in your classes and the information for promotion and tenure. and sometimes you can't do that if there are standard course evaluations. We know that's really hard to do. But one institution we worked with had an initiative out of their Teaching and Learning Center where they developed supplemental course evaluations. That faculty, a group of faculty got together, they agreed on these course evaluations. The questions were developed from questions in the Wabash study that they had not done well on. They were questions about academic challenge. They modified the questions so they applied to individual courses, not to the institution as a whole. This group of faculty gave them to their classes. The evaluations were sent back to the director of the Teaching and Learning Center, who compiled the results, so every faculty member in this collaborative got back their results versus the results of all the other faculty, but it was masked, so they couldn't see, you know, the results of their individual colleagues, but they had some comparative data, and they could compare it to the institution level data from the Wabash study to see if they were doing better or worse than their school overall. So it was a safe place for them to get different kinds of information, share it among each other, and then act on it. And it had nothing to do with promotion and tenure. But also, I'd say there's nothing to stop anyone teaching a class from just asking students, sending out a quick survey, depending on the size, asking students, you know, the 1-minute paper at the end of class, what's the most important thing you learned, what was the most helpful thing. If you have a small class, a seminar or something, you can do that, and that can give you useful information, and that just comes right back to you. That's not tied into any formal process anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, just getting back to the earlier things about this is a form of faculty development.
Yeah.
Most faculty development operations are firewalled from promotion and tenure processes, so you can go and get help with a class and so on without that instantly going into your portfolio unless you want it to. And we would treat this the same way. Interesting point here, just back where I started at the beginning, which is faculty would certainly be reluctant to do real inquiry if, you know, this is going to go on, especially when it is absolutely true that their evaluations will probably go down when they try something new. Yes. That certainly will happen. Yes. And it will confuse students, and you need to be able to ride that out without, that's exactly the point I was making about accreditation. Once you're sending stuff about your students to the outside world, it gets very hard to do real safe inquiry because you're trying to talk to somebody else about your worth. Yeah. Cool.
And actually, I would say that the point you made about being worried about doing experiments in class because you might take
Yep.
it on your course evaluations leads in lovely to Charlie's next point here.
So you should seek out hits on your course evaluations in class. Yeah, no, that's a national phenomenon. It's well documented, especially if you try more active pedagogies, more active things. That even though it's not as good for them, a lot of students love listening to a lecture. They're not getting a hell of a lot out of it, but they love listening to it. It's safe, and so we say your assessment done well should lead to experiment. Let me talk about that for a second. So, and we've actually started thinking about the way we think about the words data and evidence. To get back to something you said earlier. So when you collect your data. Right? You're doing survey data. You may be doing data from looking at student performance on an exam, papers, whatever. We call that just sort of like these basic qualitative or quantitative variables. And that data doesn't become evidence until some people look at it, a group of people look at it and come to some rough consensus about what it means. This is why I want to emphasize the social process of this. If you're in a program or a department, you can be a lone wolf, but it doesn't move your program or department forward. And so from our sense, getting back to the conversational piece, the data has the potency of evidence when some people actually say, yeah, we kind of agree, this is what it means, and that implies an action. And here's the next step. It leads to experiments, not necessarily big scale changes, okay? This is really huge because you are working with flawed data. You can't rule out also alternative causal hypotheses. Really, the only way you can go forward, and we'll say this in the next slide, is that you can run an experiment, but it's worthwhile trying small-scale experiments rather than massive change when you see something in your assessment data. Try some small things. Try one course a little bit differently. Try a program a little bit different. Try something a little different. Don't be afraid of that experiment. See what happens and talk to your colleagues about it. It doesn't necessarily always have to point to this huge, big change. And I think the challenge with experiments is, and this gets back to a question you raised earlier actually in a different way, which is when you try experiments, you have to have the freedom and safety from your colleagues up the food chain and in your department. It might fail. That's why I call it experiment. You know, figuring out what's going to help students, sometimes it's not easy. And you can see a pattern in your exams or papers where you say, what the hell's going on here? Let's try this. It may take two or three little tries before you figure it out. And that's okay. So a tolerance for the failure, room for people to do experiments. that's really a part of what you need to have an environment in which assessment can be used. And again, that's why people kind of get excited about this, because oftentimes when they're relaxed about it, people like experimenting with stuff in their class, like trying something a little different, a little new. Yeah, the answer is not in the data. Consider this an ABA design, right? The answer is not in the data. The answer is in some change. You can pound the crap out of the data sometimes, reanalyze it, recut it over and over again. The people who do well with this actually just try something a little different and see if it makes a difference in their class, not more data.
Some other things that we've seen have been helpful in moving assessment forward. Assessment done well is focused and persistent. So once people really start getting into this and looking at what's going on in their classes and things they could change, we've worked with some people who come up with these huge long lists of things they want to do, which is great because we are trying to accomplish many very ambitious things for our students. And people get really excited about it and they start to see all these things that they can investigate and look into and change. And that's wonderful. But we're all very busy. I have never talked to anyone who said, I've got a lot of free time. You know, I'm looking for something else to do. So we're all very busy. And as Charlie said, trying to understand how people learn and make changes in that is a really complicated thing. So to do assessment well, you should pick one or maybe two learning outcomes to focus on at a time. And I know that's hard because you're leaving lots of other important things on the side, and that's okay. You're not saying they're not important, you're just choosing what you want to focus on first. And then if you say, oh, well, I think there's a problem here and I should do something, change something, adjust something in my class, just change one thing at a time. Don't try to change a billion things, because then you won't actually know what was effective and what wasn't when you're trying to figure it out. So we found that really studying and making improvement in a few things rather than trying to study and change everything is what's effective. Because people who bite off too much wind up spending a lot of time and energy and just getting frustrated when nothing happens and they run out of time. Assessment also needs to be sustainable, because this is going to be, it is a part of your normal routine. It shouldn't be an add-on, something that you suddenly gear up to do because, oh my God, the accreditors are coming and I've got to get on this. So it should be something you work on a little bit all the time, so you should focus on something that matters to you, because it needs to be a continuous thing. It's something that we as professionals do as part of our normal work, because we care about what happens with our students, we care about our teaching, we take pride in it. So this assessment should be part of our professional identity. And because it needs to be sustainable, an important part of the assessment process should be stopping every now and again to say, how can I revise this? Is this working the way I want it to? And if not, or how can I revise this to make it better, more efficient, more useful? So don't just keep doing the same thing over and over again because you're in a pattern, but stop and take stock every now and again and say, is this accomplishing what I want it to do? If I'm teaching a class and I'm thinking, things aren't working so well, I really want to change things up, I think students aren't getting stuff, it's getting kind of boring for everyone, what am I going to do? Well, and take a moment, hope you can all see this. So here are some of the things I might choose to do. You think, well, active learning or flipping the classroom, portfolios, hybrid classrooms, community-based learning. Oh my God, there are all these really cool things I can do. In fact, if you pick up any higher education press now, this is the stuff they're talking about. You would think that everyone is flipping their classes. If you're not, you're just you missed the boat. But that's not the case. And I'd also say that there's nothing magic about these things up here. There's nothing magic about problem-based learning, about the thing we call, flipped classrooms. What we found in the Wabash study is that there are sort of basic characteristics behind programs like this that make them effective. So if you're trying to change up your teaching, improve your teaching, don't just focus on the sexy stuff, because it's cool and exciting, I get that, but really it's more important to hone your craft. And you can do that without additional resources, without spending a lot of time and energy to flip the classroom or learning a lot about some technology you may not know. And I'll explain a little bit more about that now. So in the Wabash study, we asked students, lots of questions about their experiences in and out of the classroom to figure out what experiences contributed to their growth on outcomes over 4 years of college. So we could look at how much students gained on a variety of outcomes over college and look at the experiences they had and see, okay, so for students who gained the most, what kinds of experiences did they have that contributed to that growth? And we found 3 broad categories of teaching practices and institutional conditions that mattered. And these won't be shocking things because there's actually been research for many years that has pointed to the same effective teaching practices. But we like to hammer the point home. So those 3 things are, we've called them good teaching and high quality interactions with faculty and staff, academic challenge and high expectations, and diversity experiences. And so the first one is when students report that they have faculty and staff who are interested in them in more than just the grades they get in their class, but are interested in them as you know, the full and rich people that they are in their lives, their careers, their hopes, goals, aspirations. Just having adults who care matters a lot. When students report that they have out-of-class interactions with faculty and staff, and when students report that the teaching that goes on in the classroom is clear and organized, they have a sense of what's coming next, what's expected of them, and when they receive prompt feedback on their work. So these are all important things. And again, this shouldn't be shocking to us. The second part, academic challenge and high expectations, really has 2 pieces. One is sort of a basic workload thing. So how much work are students doing? How much are they reading? How much are they writing? Are they doing drafts? Are they spending the time necessary to prepare for classes? It's really important. And the second part of that is the kind of work that students are doing. So are they doing higher order intellectual activities? Are they analyzing things, synthesizing things, making judgments, or are they spending their time memorizing a bunch of facts? The higher order activities are the ones that matter. And then the third thing we've called interactional diversity, and that is when students report they are having experiences with people who are different from them, who have ideas and perspectives that are different from their own, and they're encountering these new and different perspectives and ideas, being challenged in the way they think about the world. So these are 3 broad categories of things that matter. And all those things on the previous slide, the flipped classrooms, the study abroad, internships, when those programs are effective, they tend to be effective because they have these 3 characteristics. And they do these things. So people talk about them because I think in some of those programs you tend to see more of these things. But any of us can do more of this in any of our class, regardless of the format. It doesn't take a lot of resources. It doesn't take a lot of money investment to do this. We can all do more of this now.
Yeah, so just if you're an analytic gearhead like I am, literally what it means, if you look at these high impact practices and you control for those good practices, the effects of high impact practices go away. All right, so undergraduate research works really well when it's well taught, it's requiring you to think harder, you're working hard, you're encountering new ideas and people. Internships, service learning matter when they're well taught, there are adults around who care and structuring your work, you're reflecting on it, engaging higher activities, encountering new ideas and new people. First year seminars, teamwork, those things all seem to work when they have these underlying things built into them.
And I think we use the word hone your craft, and I just want to talk about that for a minute because I think teaching really is a craft, and it's a craft that we will work on our entire lives. It's not something where you wake up one day and you're like, I've mastered it, okay, good, I'm done, and I can move on to something else. Because things will change. There are always new things that I can learn in the classroom. My students will change. It's a dynamic environment. So it's a craft. And you all know that because you can go into a class, you can do something that can work really well one semester, do the same thing the next semester, and it can just bomb. So this is a craft, and I think for us, doing assessment well means improving your teaching, and that means honing the craft of being a teacher, which is a lifelong activity.
I think I know the reason why the study was done at Wabash, but on that last point in particular, interactional diversity, how much does the fact that it was done at a single-sex college affect your findings or limit what you can really learn here?
Actually, the study was done on 17,000 students at 49 schools.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we kept getting zeros for our gender thing. I don't know why. I didn't know how to figure it out. Yeah, so that's why we could do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why we could do it. Yeah, and by the way, it's interesting. The diversity thing is what was fascinating about it is the classroom diversity experiences didn't matter so much. It was whether you had meaningful conversations with people who were different from you. That's what popped up. They could have arisen in a class, but not necessarily. And they don't necessarily happen in environments where there's high structural diversity. That's the other thing we found out. It's not correlated with places that have diverse student populations in a really strong way. Because sometimes those diverse student populations segment off and don't really interact that much. Yeah, that's a good question.
Most of what you've been saying, if I understand it correctly, is based on course teaching. Yet we're being asked to assess at the programmatic level, very much so, in fact.
Yeah.
And although I see some translational aspects to it,
Yeah.
I also think there are some very big differences.
Okay.
Could you speak to that?
Well, so tell me what you think the differences are before I respond. It would be helpful to me.
I think that there's the interaction of coursework, of course. I think that there's the collective personality of the faculty in the
Yeah.
program. I think that there are student attitudes about their enrollment in a specific program.
Yep.
I mean, I could go on.
Okay, so actually we were talking about program-based. So if you think back what we were talking about, so one of the slides that Kathy had, for example, was it's really important to look at where your students start. And where they start can include things like dispositions, why they're in your major, all those other pieces that sort of play a role of what they're bringing to the classes your colleagues and you are dealing with. The conversational element, you can actually do great classroom assessment and improvement without any conversations at all, right? You can do it on your own. But for us, one of the reasons we emphasize that is places where it's working well are where the people in the department program are getting together and talking about what's happening in their classes or the other elements of the program, in the laboratories, wherever they have student work, and they're sort of talking about what's this combined effect we're having. That's the net effect of their conversation. They're talking about what's going on. There are different elements of that program and talking with one another about what's the effect of it. So and then the changes, even then, are things that result from the conversation that people in the program department talk about it and know what's happening. And we're going to try and experiment in this part of it here rather than that part. So actually, we've been trying to emphasize the program level. But certainly all things you say are true. And in fact, I think, again, the conversational element is because some departments, I've been part of some departments like this, we didn't talk very much at all or well. There was this great quote I saw, what was it, someone who was doing some assessment stuff, and it was like, and we talk about conversations, like, if I wanted to do conversations, I would not have gone into the academy, right? But, and here's the thing, as true as that is, it turns out that our universities as teaching organizations function by collective work. We organize our curricula that way. We, the people who voted the curricula, organized and said, we're going to work, you didn't say this actually, but by taking the sequence of courses, which we'll all work on separately, this is what's going to happen to you by the time you walk across that stage, right? And so we actually have signed on for organized work, but I would argue that we sort of, there's a, what was it, we believe in the unseen hand of the curriculum, and that if we all do our own stuff in our own classes, then magically the outcomes will sort of happen for our students. And it turns out that's not true.
Let's say an institution collects a certain amount of information, and after your talk, it wants to collect much more.
No.
Yeah, what would be the best approach and structural changes? So, what would you recommend?
Best approach would not be, collecting more information is the worst thing you should do. The worst thing you should do. Places are awash in information. I think it's curating the information that's important. What do you already have? What do you already have that you're collecting by virtue of your tests and papers? What are you already doing in your classes that are actually useful information for this work? I would not advocate adding more data to it. In fact, one of the things we do when we visit an institution, we used to call something official. It's called a data audit, which is what do you already have? And for most places we go to, they already have so much stuff that is either socked away in databases that people can't get to, or they don't know they have it. I can tell you a great Wabash study. So this is a great. We were at an institution that participated in the Wabash study, and it was a small liberal arts college. And one of the things we were going through the data, and one of the things we noted, people said, well, the students really can't. They don't have time to work on classes later on in the day because they're all working. And we said, well, that's funny. According to students themselves, only like 5% of them say they're working either on or off campus. And the fact is, well, that's not true. Well, that's new. This is a weird cohort. What happened there? And the poor IR person was in the back of the room sort of nodding his head, saying, we have known this for 15 years or 10 years, ever since we started administering the NESE survey. I've been reporting it out to you, but no one saw that it was there. It did not take part in the conversation it was sitting on a shelf, or it wasn't recognized in some way. And the view that students were, in fact, didn't have time to do some after-class activities because they was guiding curricular decisions. But it wasn't true. So no, don't get more data, whatever you do. So I do apologize. I am a nerd. You can tell from looking at these documents, there is no Starfleet Academy. I wish
But wouldn't it be cool if
there was.
I mean, really.
Okay.
You are now all at Starfleet Academy. How very cool.
You sound sarcastic when you say that.
It is very cool. We have, what is it, tasers and things for people.
We have tasers, yes.
Yes, exactly. So,
Phasers, actually phasers.
phasers, tasers, you know. So Starfleet Academy is a private research university.
Make sure they're on round one. Let's make sure they're on round one.
Oh, yes. So let's see. So actually, well, first I'm just going over the information.
Okay,
This
good.
sheet. So the piece of paper you're looking at should be called Additional Information About Starfleet Academy and the WARF Program of Peace and Conflict Studies. You may be familiar with it. So Starfleet Academy is a private research university with around 17,000 undergraduates and 14,000 graduate students. May seem slightly familiar there. And that's all we're going to tell you about Starfleet Academy. Because we don't think you need a lot of other context. But I would say if you have questions as you're going through this activity, I would think about the context here at BU and sort of apply sort of the structures and processes in place here. But we have an assessment report from the WARF Program of Peace and Conflict Studies. And this program has 14 tenured and tenure track and 5 adjunct faculty in it. There are 12 courses that make up the major, and it graduates about 60 students a year. There is some additional information about the courses that are included in the major on this piece of paper and a little information about the sections. But as you'll see in the assessment report in a minute, the assessment report focuses on 4 classes. There are 3 junior level classes, PCAN 315, 316, and 317, which are capped at 30 students. And then there's a senior seminar that every student who majors in peace and conflict studies has to take. And there are 4 sections of that every year. So I will let you read the rest of this when you go into the activity. But that's just a little background information about Starfleet Academy and this program. Then the next document looks like this. It's called the SA Assessment Report. It's double-sided. So this is a copy of the assessment report that the Peace and Conflict Studies program did. And the first page includes, the standard contact information for people in the department. But then it talks about learning outcomes for the program. And as you'll see, there are 2 learning outcomes. One is knowledge about theories, research, and controversies in peace and conflict studies. More information about that below and how students meet that. And then the second outcome is critical thinking in peace and conflict studies. And there's some more information below that outlines exactly what critical thinking is in the peace and conflict studies program. I will not read through that because you can do that on your own. And then the back of the piece of paper, which is round 1, actually talks about the evidence that this program gathered to determine whether students were achieving those learning outcomes. It talks about the extent to which faculty in the program discuss the assessment results and what they found. So they gathered this evidence and what they found about how their students were growing on those 2 learning outcomes. So that is all the information you have for round 1. Some information about Starfleet Academy and the Peace and Conflict Studies program and their first assessment report. We're going to ask each table to review that information. Again, keeping the round 2 information off to the side, but review those pieces of paper we just went over. Of course, the always important in group work, appoint a scribe for your group, very important. Everyone always jumps and volunteers for that task. And then we have a little worksheet here. So the first page is the page you're going to be focusing on. It says worksheet round 1. And there are 4 questions on that that we would like each group to talk about and address. So we'd like each table to, after reviewing the assessment report, talk about what the most useful parts of the Peace and Conflict Studies assessment process and assessment report are. So you need to infer what you can from the assessment process from the report, but what's the most useful part of what you see there? And what parts of the assessment process or report are unclear, confusing, unhelpful, could be improved? We'd also like you to talk about what other information you would like to have to get a better sense of how well students in this program are doing on those 2 learning outcomes that the program identified. So this is a case where we will ask you, what other data would you like, if you could collect other data. And then finally, if you were in this department, if you were in this program, what next steps would you take based on the information that you have in this 2-page assessment report? What would you do based on this? To improve student learning, of course. Should say that, yes. And I think that's it. So we have, maybe give folks tables about 20 minutes to work on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, so we'll give about 20 minutes to work on that, and then we will ask tables to report out. So again, here's where having the scribe, the recorder, is very important.
So let's go through this a little bit. So you're looking at this assessment report. What was the most useful part of this report for you? What did you find were the useful parts of the report? Space 9, thank you. Yes, sir.
We thought the most useful part was that it revealed the disjunction between learning facts and learning to discuss and organize and present ideas, and so that the way the assessment worked was that it clearly demonstrated success in one area and failure in another.
Yep. Good. 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 Other things that thought was useful about this?
Well, we gave them credit for the fact that they obviously had talked about learning outcomes. Okay. And they obviously had, oh, and here's our scribe / spokesperson. I'll finish it then. So we gave them credit for the fact that they talked about their learning outcome and that they had a retreat. So they were having some conversations, albeit not as many as they should.
And I think our table gave them credit for watching it for 3 years, having some time frame doing it,
Excellent.
even if they didn't break it down.
Good. Good. Okay. What was unhelpful or less helpful or confusing?
Under learning outcomes, this first item, knowledge about theories, research, etc., all it does is to list the courses that they're taking.
Yep.
It simply describes the major, but it doesn't
Yep.
tell us what they actually
Yeah,
learn.
and there's no idea even what those test scores mean. You know, if the tests are broken down, what competencies the tests are trying to get at. Yeah, absolutely. Good, good. What other things were less than helpful? Yeah.
So we had said that part of the problem was that in no part of this do we see, although we see specific objectives laid out, especially in the second section, we're not seeing what they're doing in order to develop these particular skills and elicit this kind of production.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no evidence there at all. You're not sure what the outcomes are really, and on the content stuff, but what are the pieces of knowledge they're after? Just knowledge in general, nothing about process. Yeah, good, good. Other things that you would like to have had or were missing?
Are the courses in this major, is that comprehensive the entire university? Is there a writing course they have to take at any point? It's a requirement?
That's a great question.
Because obviously there's an issue with them conveying thought. So we sort of were wondering about whether or not this was a problem with the major not providing that, or if it was something that the whole academy was not providing, that sort of thing.
Like to have seen is it wasn't clear to us whether or not they were doing any assessment in the first 2 years. And it looks like we're just getting things in the junior and senior year, and we don't see how that can be so helpful.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, good, good, good. So just based on the evidence you have, just out of curiosity here, what would you like to do next? What next steps would you take?
Okay. You just have 2 examples of the multiple choice test and the paper are just examples of direct assessment, and I think mixing in some indirect assessment measures really throughout the 4 years. I think this is just, I mean, if you think about it, you're not really getting any feedback on student learning until the end of year 3. Well, those could go back to some of the student feedback that we heard about earlier. Just one example there.
Yeah, so student surveys on classroom practices.
Heard some great things yesterday about one of the departments that does a town hall and gets feedback from the students about student learning. And then another department, and forgive me for forgetting which departments do this, but another engineer had, I think chemistry had the exit interviews. The dean does exit interviews with the students. And those are great ideas. And I think could really glean some useful knowledge.
Yeah.
Perhaps somebody's here that could speak more directly about that.
Yeah, I thought there were seniors, yeah.
all we have is summative assessments here. All we see are final grades, final papers, and final exam information, and that's great because it's data driven, but it's really limited. We're not hearing about the non-graded work and whether or not that's actually targeted to real production, and we're not seeing anything at all about the rubrics that they're using to measure the assessment, especially in the paper. Which criteria are they using?
You're assuming they're using rubrics?
Right. Are they using the same, Brian, yes, are they using a rubric, and if so, are they using the same rubric?
Feels
right?
like a C, come on. Yes.
I was also saying it's really hard to assess something when you don't have really well articulated learning outcomes.
Yep.
So even going back to that beginning, is like, to me, that's just sort of the basic. You start there and then build everything else based on that.
Yeah, and just I think going off with the rubrics, I think they actually have more data than they have looked into. So what I would have liked is to reevaluate the data they have after having some conversation to get more useful information, like how those were graded, if there was a breakdown of the grades and so on in different learning levels of learning.
Right, right. So would you agree this is kind of a crappy report? So I hate to say it, this is not unusual. I mean, we as part of the fun, this is why we just love the job. We get to review department assessment reports. And some of them are kind of like, yep, we have a gateway course at the third year. We want X% of our students to get a 75. You have no idea what that means or why X% is appropriate. It's sort of like pulled out of thin air. You often hear about faculty being displeased with certain elements, and maybe appropriately so, but there's just no why there. And I think what was interesting, what we hope you saw, is that it's kind of hard to, in a sense, for the faculty themselves, if they want to make this better, do they have enough information here to make some good choices? So they're not duplicating their own work, right? They're not duplicating their work. Okay. Sure. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Just the process in our group is that it was really easy to jump to number 4. Like we started already attacking and thinking about the curriculum and this and that and what could be different, and we had to really back ourselves up a couple times and say, let's start with question 1 here. Let's start with 2. Because it's really easy to just jump right in and forget how important it is to ask those questions.
Well, and that's a great point. Also because sometimes we see a problem, what might be going on, that's based on some other prior knowledge we have that may not be appropriate in this case. Now, you're going to get to find this out now, right, if there's any more questions. Yeah, okay, got one more question there. Yeah, yeah.
We also noted that the faculty discussed the grade distributions at their annual retreat, and it seemed like that was the only meeting that was really had, at least according to this document. We just wondered if they're trying to do absolutely everything at the retreat, which usually these things...
Oh, I can't imagine a department doing that. Yeah, could you? Yes. Okay.
I think one way to approach this, and I was thinking about your ideas yesterday about getting a narrative going in people's own languages, is that for instance, I think the strength of the report is the critical thinking, how that is articulated. And so if you're talking about next steps, what I would suggest is maybe take those learning outcomes there and then start to think about those sophomore courses, those seminar courses. And I imagine in the seminar courses, maybe unlike the freshman course, you would be writing maybe a seminar paper and see if those learning outcomes are how they are coming across in those sophomore level courses. So I think the thing is, in terms of next steps, is instead of totally beating the people up, if you're working with them, to try and take what's strong out of this and then kind of expand it. And I think really the kernel of this is those pretty clearly articulated learning outcomes.
So one thing we talked yesterday about narratives, I think the point we were talking about yesterday was the idea that the reports, when they come from a department or program, should come within the language and epistemological framework of the department or program. So that one from mechanical engineering is going to look different from one from English literature or as part of the humanities, and that's okay. But that structuring a narrative that's using the way you normally think about things is really good. And I think after that meeting, I thought about Lee Shulman as a guy who's done some wonderful work. He's the head of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching out at Stanford. And he talked about accountability. Rather than thinking about it as like being proof or whatever, he said it's from the old word of account, giving an account. What's the story? The assessment report's what's the story? Yeah.
Also, we noticed that when you look at when you should take the course, everything is anytime before senior year.
Yep.
And then they have 3 major courses in their junior year,
yep.
which is a lot, right? And then, so who knows how much they can actually retain with that many courses. So we thought they may want to assess what's their justification
Absolutely.
for that? And can there be a way of restructuring the curriculum so
Right.
that, you know, maybe push one to sophomore year?
Or even taking sometimes, just get a sample of 10 transcripts of students from your major and say, what was their pathway through? When did they take these things? Are we, you know, just to see what's happening there formatively. Okay.
And it just always occurred to me that it's somewhat arbitrary where you set
Totally
that mark.
arbitrary.
And that
Yeah.
There's probably a tendency to set it so that there's always at least a little room for improvement.
Yeah.
But that most are doing
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you had any guidance about how to kind of set reasonable, good benchmarks and keep it moving, I guess.
I think I'd be, you're right, and I think in this case I'd be honest and, you know, I'd have an aspirational stretch goal and call it that. And we'd like to see in the best of all possible worlds, here's where we'd like to be with how many students do well in this. Because they're never going to be 100%, but call it an aspirational goal.
Yeah.
And the question is, can you sort of inch your way over time a little bit closer to that, or at least not go farther away from that. Yeah. So let's go to the second part of this activity, right? So you now have the assessment committee sent the report back. Now you have round two. Take a look, and I think, you know, don't write down the same questions. I think. What do you think?
Oh, there are different questions.
There are different questions. Okay.
Second sheet, different
Second
questions.
sheet, so different questions. Take a look at this fuller version of the report, and here's some questions. So Kathy, if you.
Well, you'll notice actually, so the report is longer because when the program got their report back, they did some additional things. So you'll see the same information. Amazingly, the grade distribution was exactly the same the second year as it was the first year, but they've done some additional things, collected some additional data. So we'd like you to look through the round two report, which is a little fuller, and then answer the questions on the second worksheet, which is the first one is this report and the new assessment process, as you can infer it from the report, more or less useful than the one you saw in round one, and why is that? And then how would you revise the process now to make it more useful? Again, is there other information you gather? Because you see more stuff here, so do you still want additional information? Are there tweaks you would make to the process as you hear it described in this report that you think would be more helpful for the program? And then, you know, so based on this new information, what would you do? Has your answer changed from the first round? Would you take a different approach now that you have this different information?
First off, I really want to thank you for either digging into these things or looking to me like you're digging into these things. I really appreciate it. Clearly the Star Trek jokes went nowhere, but I appreciate you not mocking me too much. That's good. So let's talk about these a little bit. Is this report more useful to you?
Well, first of all, the term paper wasn't simply analyzed in terms of this gives me a gut ache to read. It was analyzed in terms of the 5 specified learning outcomes, and we were told that it met 1 and 2, but not 3, 4, and 5.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very helpful, narrowing down the ways in which the program is not meeting its objectives.
Exactly, yeah.
Secondly, we thought that the comparative data from other institutions in the Galactic Federation was very useful in suggesting new questions. That is, the comparison that showed that the students at Starfleet Academy, in our program at any rate, were very good at collaborative work and at rote memorization, but not good at creative or analytical or critical thinking. It sounded like maybe the Galactic Federation is a sort of USSR of the future.
Bless you.
Good on communal, not so good on criticism.
It might have been Romulan. We just don't know. I mean, that's
could be.
We also liked that it incorporated some of the students' opinions. They asked, they surveyed the students and got some feedback directly from them on what the students felt they were actually achieving out of the program.
Okay.
So I found it very useful in pointing pretty clearly to the fault being in the curriculum and the faculty.
Right.
The students appear to all be doing the right things and putting the energies in the right kinds of activities and reaching out to their faculty and their peers. And, but they're not being prepared at the lower level of the curriculum to ask or answer those kinds of more analytical and critical questions. So I think the earlier exercise said the faculty thought that they were attracting the worst students in the university.
Exactly.
And I think the students are attracting the worst faculty in the university.
Kathy, I know we've had a chance last year to work with. We work with students at every institution, and in the last year we worked with some people at Ivy League schools, some faculty there, and community colleges. And it turns out that the complaint about writing is universal, and that you actually can't tell which institution they're from. So you can literally have someone from Ivy League saying, they can't write a paragraph, a sentence, seriously. I get what a word, you know. It's like, okay, you're horrible, horrible students. Yeah, good. So, and the only thing I would say is, I would never say it as the faculty's fault. You know, just say that this is an opportunity. You know, and actually mean that seriously, because if you do this kind of, you know, this would be a self-reflective report from a department. If they said, oh, we got to fix this, in a way they're owning it. So it's good for them. Good. Other things that you saw that were useful to you? Oh, did it change your opinion about what to do next?
The first 2 years and the final 2 years.
So it's really clear that there was a problem in terms of the way the courses, the prior courses were taught.
Both in the results from the papers and the NESI data.
Okay, good. Yeah.
You said, for example, going in more focused as what might be the higher priority. So I think that comparison to the rest of the school too made us think that maybe there was something else that was changed in the path the students were taking that resulted in a bigger gap now.
Yep.
And maybe the department should follow up on that before just trying to fix it at a department level.
Okay,
which we didn't think before.
Interesting. Okay, good. Good. Other folks, anything it changed how you were thinking about things a little bit? Yeah.
It really confirmed, I think, as Tom said, for us. We didn't understand why there was no assessment of student learning in the first 2 years. And we talked about that, and we thought, well, maybe they don't consider that these people will continue in the major. Why evaluate work if it's not going to be used?
Yeah.
And then we talked about, well, maybe students could put together, say, an e-portfolio in the sophomore year.
Yeah.
And we also wondered about the rubric. Is the rubric something that just faculty use, or was it distributed to students?
That's a great
And was it
question.
made explicit?
I don't know in this case, but those are great questions to ask. I mean, our view, I think, was that you always make the rubrics explicit. You put them out there, you let people see them, let them understand what you're at, let them understand how you understand quality. Because they have to pick this up. They have to understand how the faculty, what the faculty mean by quality. And so show them.
Maybe we get some things at the beginning, if we get anything, and then they're very focused on the end, how they do in the end.
Yep.
But we have no data on what's happening in their classes throughout their 4 years.
I thought so. The revelation from the NSSE data is that they have a better than average culture of interaction amongst
Yes.
students and between
Yeah.
students and faculty than, and that suggests a new way of solving some of their other problems.
Right.
So you can redirect those discussions towards the more analytical, tit-for-tat,
Exactly.
sort of dialectic.
Exactly. I mean, so a couple of things here. So I think you're right. I mean, what we've tried to do here is fill in a little bit more of the 3 questions, give you some process stuff. By the way, the survey, these are data you all have here already. So these are questions that your students have been surveyed on in 2014. Those data are available by department to look at the process piece for majors. The rubric is actually a widely used critical thinking rubric. So are the outcomes. I use the same language from the rubric. If you thought that was kind of interesting or useful at all, you can easily download that rubric from ACNU. It's free, and it can be useful, or as a starting place for discussions. Try to do that. To me, if I was sort of looking, if I was like the assessment director and I looked at this, I would probably say, even though it didn't have those things, I'd say, this is good. And I'd say it's good because there's enough information here, in my view, that actions have enough grounding that they're probably going to work. Right? The way I would look at the first report versus the second is that people have, and this is why we're getting back to the very original point about if you're going to do this, you might as well do it well enough to get something out of it. If you have enough information, the second thing, it seems to me, whatever interventions you have, they probably have a 70, 80% chance of actually hitting it. Right? Whereas the first time, you're more in the woods. You may change something, which might waste faculty time, right? Waste student time. And so the point being, sometimes with these assessment reports, doing a little more up front in the process actually makes it more effective for you, that your work in changing things is more likely to bear fruit. It's more efficient. And that's, so gathering these more pieces of information, you don't have to do everything, but enough so you can have a reasonable judgment about what's going on, and one that gives you enough information to push back against your ideas. I've been in departments like this. I can assure you, we had at Wabash College, Little Wabash College, we had comprehensive exams. We were talking about yesterday, written exams and oral exams for all students. In psychology, we did a comprehensive exam. And we had this kind of dissatisfaction with the final comprehensive exam that seniors took. And this is drawn from my experience. It was because the prior courses were basically memorization, right? Basically memorization. And we never thought of that, though. It was not until we did some classroom survey stuff, it's like, ooh, oh my. You know, I thought I was doing conceptual stuff when I was putting up my PowerPoints and having you memorize and report back to me on my tests, right? But sometimes that self-awareness is hard. That's hard. It's really
I don't know how many people's programs are like my program, in which the first 2 years are requirements that are spread all over this very large university.
Yep.
And so in terms of, you know, my access to course details, et cetera, I really have to focus on the junior and senior years.
Yep. Yeah.
And so how does that kind of, and I'm sure there are a lot of programs like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or there are other programs that are actually the opposite way too, where you have some sort of interdisciplinary program where it's departments all over the place are doing the capstone even. In your case, I think what my recommendation would be something you're in the first classes that you get in the junior year is some sort of initial assessment of just where they are. What would give you a sense of where they are conceptually, what they brought in with them. That incoming piece, which you pointed out a second ago, where they start, would be really crucial. You know, what are they bringing in? In my sense, is how varied is it, given where they're all over the place? Do you ever get a sense of what's the landscape of the classroom you're dealing with? Yeah, that's where I'd start with.
So one thing we noticed at our table was there was a kind of structural problem that is built into the curriculum, which is that adjunct faculty teach the majority of 100-level classes. And I think that's an important thing to notice.
Huge.
Because how are you going to create, you talk about handoff problems, right? How are you going to create a consistent point of entry to a program if you have adjuncts teaching your introductory classes? All right, and you see this, you see the same approach mirrored in the faculty's responses. The tendency is always to blame downward. So we will stipulate that the writing program is doing a disastrous job with these students. I'm the writing program director. So.
Yeah.
But then also the quality of students is poor coming in. Right?
Yes.
So it seems both structurally and in their perspectives, there's a tendency to push responsibility for these outcomes down either to the beginning or to before the beginning of the entry point of the program. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that as a pattern. Is that something you see?
Yes. I mean, that's why I built it into here. I mean, that first blame the students, right? Is whenever things aren't going as well as you want, and part of your
the adjuncts and then blame the writing.
Because blame rolls downhill. It's naturally. No, absolutely it does. And so I think that's one I tried to structure this so that they did get a piece of evidence that pushed back on that a little bit. And in fact, we have worked with institutions, even in the Wabash study, where they did poorly on some of the early, the good practices. And the initial thing was, it's the adjuncts. It's the adjuncts. And the first thing they did was actually try to go and look and separate out classes, right? And they found, of course, no difference. And they've also created a separate faculty development program for the adjuncts, which is, a supplemental one that really does a very good job of bringing the adjuncts into the conversation. I think that's the route, right? That's the national route is going to be, if we're really going to, and I don't know what the pay rate is here, but if we're really going to pay people $3,000 and $5,000 to cover our courses for us, we really owe them, we're obligated in some way to really make them part of our community for relying on that, and to engage them in our development work, and to structure things so they can get access to those things, and get them into our departments so they know what the hell's going on. Yeah.
So I think Joe has brought up the critical problem here. And Tom had actually said, well, from this report, round 2, 5B, these applying facts, theories, analyzing an idea experience, forming a new idea, synthesis, analysis, critical thinking, these skills should have all been developed in the 100, 200 level classes. So we were also talking about earlier on how it would be very, 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 very good if we could actually see the actual writing assignments from 100, from 200, either formal or informal, so that we could put that in the e-portfolio that our colleague over there had suggested in the earlier stages of the evaluative process. So that in the end, it's really, as our colleagues earlier had said in the other table, it is a formative and not summative assessment of the 4-year experience at this particular institution.
I couldn't agree more. And I think part of the reason I structured this way is that I see that as an incremental step. That if departments make some steps towards things, get some discovery, they get some more interest. There's a great case study in an assessment book from the engineering department at Miami, Ohio. Over the years, they were dissatisfied with the final projects in engineering. It's like a 4-year process where they, essentially what you described, started working, first of all, that was the course just prior to the project course. They changed that. Then it was stepping back down, and then it was stepping back down, and they eventually worked themselves into sort of a revision of their entire curriculum, doing more discovery learning early on, things like that, because they were surprised at the lack of creativity in the senior project. But it took them a while to get there, and I think that's okay. If you get people into the inquiry, start asking questions, get comfortable doing it, it may take some time to get there, but encourage them to get there. So but I agree with you totally. Yeah.
But we know that sometimes with workshops, there's a tendency you may think, oh, that's really cool, that's neat, and then you walk away and it sort of disappears into the ether as you go back to all the things that take your time every day. So we wanted everyone just to take a few minutes individually, and this is on the third sheet of the worksheet packet you have. Just take a couple minutes to think and write about if you heard or learned anything today that surprised you or you think is worth thinking about more for your work in your program or your department. And thinking about how you might apply the things you've learned today in your work. Just a few moments.
We'll talk about it.
If people want to share, yes, you can, but just to capture anything now.
Okay, let's just talk for a minute or two and then we'll finish up. So by the way, of course, you probably already know this, but in case you don't, I mean, people talk about the complexity of assessment. You're doing the classic, right? This is the classic 5-minute paper. It's been around since, I think, 1959, where you ask students, I think Freddie Musseller was a statistician at Harvard who came up with this, where you ask students what was the most important point, what surprised them, and what's so confused about. Just 3 questions in a class, have people write it out, pass it in. Really effective technique. Do it once in a while, and look what people say. It's really useful. So, anyway, some comments. So, anything surprising today?
The differences between your best practices and say the AAC and U 10 high impact practices, whereas you seem to focus more on the honing the existing craft, whatever that, however your method or medium might be, versus adopting, certain technology or gadgetry. And I think that what I like is I think that'll speak well to at least our faculty. Many have seen all these new gadgets come down the pike, and they're very skeptical of it. This is the latest and greatest, and let's just wait it out and it'll go away. But I think yours is different. And I think that will actually speak better to many faculty than the high impact practices.
Well, and I said part of this is a data reason. You can account for the effect of the high impact practices. They always have a little caveat: the high impact practices, done well, have effects. Done well means the things we just talked about. And analytically, you can account for their effect by looking at those things. So there's some researchers who are actually kind of worried about the high impact practices and that people will adopt these things which overtly look like the high impact practices, but actually when they're running on the ground, don't do the good things they need to do. And it is a craft. This is a lifelong thing. There's stuff I learned when I'm 55 that I couldn't do when I'm 30 in the classroom. You get better at this, or you can if you're reflective and work on it. Yeah.
This isn't a surprise, but I do have a question for you.
Sure.
I've heard very conflicting views about the efficacy of PowerPoint, and I wonder, you have used according to some reports, PowerPoint isn't all that useful. Other reports, just the contrary. What have your studies determined about PowerPoint?
We have not studied PowerPoint. I think, yeah, we have not looked at it. I think, I don't want to confuse the technology with how it's used.
Well, back to gadgets and all that sort
Yeah,
of thing.
I don't want to confuse the technology with how it's used. I know plenty of places where people literally sit up in front and actually they get the textbooks. The textbook manufacturers give them the PowerPoints. In my old day, they used to give them the slides, so you get the transparencies. Now they give them the PowerPoint, and they bang through them, and they're sort of reading through the text, essentially. The PowerPoint's not the problem there, right, and so on. So I think there's good ways to use it and not, but I really think it's more context-specific than that. I think PowerPoint's largely overused.
So it's just a neutral thing. It can be abused or used.
I would argue that, yeah.
Yes, I would say it depends on how it's used. So when we talk to students at all the institutions we go to, we always try to talk to students, and you hear students talking about the classes that aren't as helpful for them, and one thing they will say is it was just, one PowerPoint after another. They posted the slides ahead of time, or they gave them to me after. I didn't need to be there. There was nothing. I was reading the information. The professor was reading the information. Yeah. I didn't get anything different, new from being in the class. It didn't make me think about anything. So in that's I would say a bad use of PowerPoint. But if you use PowerPoint differently, and you still, you're not just reading off the slides, you're still asking students to think carefully about things, to analyze things, to make connections, then it can be used well.
Using for images.
So it's all, I think any tool can be used well or poorly. It all depends in what you're doing with it.
So some point a few years ago, I was at some workshop that BU put on, and surveying students was sort of presented as one kind of decent form of getting outcomes information. And so at the very beginning of this workshop, you said, actually, it's no better than random in terms of comparison. And I feel like that actually upended something that we have learned from BU.
Okay.
So I just would love to hear more about that, because we survey them at the end of the third. We are in a 3-year program. We survey them at the end of the 3rd year. We survey them at the end of the 1st year, and we plan to survey them at the end of every course, trying to kind of take stock of how they perceive the learning outcomes. We wouldn't use it as its own tool, but we just thought that it was one piece of an assessment program, and I feel like that's what we learned.
So.
Here. Not from you.
Yeah. So I think there's a paper out in the New Direction Institutional Research, we're using data from our study and other places, that essentially when you're asking students questions about outcomes, you're sort of getting at satisfaction. Even the National Survey of Student Engagement talks about it this way now. They've backed off of what those, so it's this useful information. Student survey responses on process are very useful. What's happening? What are we doing? The kinds of nested questions there. On outcomes, there's just not good evidence suggesting, in my view, and I think there's now some review articles in this, that it's giving you a good gauge of how much students are learning and changing. Not because students are bad at this, it's from human cognition standpoint. A, our self-evaluation of how effective we are is challenging. B, our capacity to remember where we were 6 months ago or 3 months ago is awful. Humans don't have that kind of recall. We don't recall snapshots. So they're useful in one sense, as I said, the sort of satisfaction or the engaging thing sense, but I wouldn't use them as a proxy for learning.
But actually, one thing you had said earlier is, I think, worth re-emphasizing. That satisfaction piece is a very important prerequisite for learning. So I think why I wanted to bring it up again is for all the skeptics about collecting data on student attitudes, I think it is important to establish the value of those, because what I took from here, I really like the one of the intern and the sleeping example you gave, because if everybody who's making some policy decisions can be given some examples that they can relate to, and then maybe recap the problem, I think then it becomes more effective trying to come up with solutions. So I think it is important to learn about the attitudes, not necessarily with the hope that it's going to fix the problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. So we're not saying don't measure, just take it in its proper context. So let me actually reinforce what you just said, and then talk about it just from a data standpoint, how this all wiggles together. We literally are just reviewing some analyses we were doing on this one set of questions. One of the things, when you've got 1,000 different variables, you say, okay, what's the most, if I had to do one thing, what would be the thing that promoted student learning the most? And we have this set of questions on clear and organized instruction, right? So it's about, were the course goals presented clearly? Would the faculty come to class well prepared? Very sort of mundane classroom level things. That, it turns out, is the most potent set of questions we have in terms of predicting growth. It has impact across like 10 of our 11 outcomes we measured, including critical thinking, moral reasoning, persistence, GPA, et cetera. So here's where it gets to your part of the story. So the question is, well, why is that happening? Is it just because it's pedagogically more organized? Well, it turns out when you do the analyses, what's really happening is that getting clear and organized instructions, A, gives students a sense that the faculty member cares about their development, and B, increases satisfaction. Those are the two mediating variables which are actually having the effect on growth and the outcome. So it essentially, clear and organized instruction changes the student's attitude towards the material, increases their satisfaction. That means they actually work harder in class. That's the mechanism, okay? So satisfaction is very important. It's a step towards the outcome, dissatisfaction is not good. As I said before, not having learning on the outcomes is not good. It's just not a replacement for the actual work they're doing on the content or whatever you're doing in the classroom. Yeah. Okay, we'll release you. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We appreciate it. Get lunch.